Joining us now is Andrew Tangel, reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Andrew, thanks for joining us this morning. Really important report that you have in the Journal. Why did the 737 MAX continue to fly even after the FAA found a, quote, high risk of emergency with the planes?
Well, the FAA determined quickly that they had to act quickly with some sort of interim action. And that was the Emergency Airworthiness Directive, sort of like an emergency bulletin blast to the world's airlines and pilots that fly the MAX, saying, hey, there's an existing emergency procedure to deal with this type of cockpit emergency. And the analysis was that that emergency action gave them some time. It bought them some time to push Boeing to make a more permanent fix. And they determined that they had a number of months for that permanent fix to be designed and put on the airplane. So they thought they had some time, and that's why they were okay with the planes continuing to fly.
Okay, so Andrew, your great report in the Wall Street Journal comes after a New York Times investigation over the weekend, and the Times investigation showing that actually the FAA looked through its records and had very little oversight, if any oversight whatsoever, basically none, over this MCAS system as it was approved for the first time by regulators. And so do you have any insight as to when they were going back, going through their files, identifying what was wrong after the first crash? I mean, where did the information come from, and what were they basing this judgment on?
Right after the Lion Air accident, regulators and airlines and pilots were, in many ways, learning about this new system, MCAS, and finding out a bit more about how it worked, the potential hazards with it. And so in those early days after Lion Air, regulators are trying to figure out exactly how it was structured, what triggers it, how it can be counteracted and so forth, and how its design might be shored up and made more robust to prevent this type of accident from occurring. And Boeing immediately started working on the MCAS software fix, Boeing says, right after that crash. And so it's, the pilot community, airlines, and regulators were learning a lot about this system right after that crash, and there was a lot more information that was gathered at that time.
A lot of attention obviously has been focused on Boeing and on the 737 MAX itself, but I'm curious about what kind of calls you've heard from consumer safety advocates about changes at the FAA or changes with the way that the FAA regulates that they're calling on to happen. I mean, is there a too cozy of a relationship between the FAA and Boeing?
Certainly a question lawmakers are asking, as well as safety experts and critics of the delegation structure that's evolved with the FAA. We heard yesterday in the U.S. Senate tough questions being asked by U.S. senators of the FAA officials overseeing certification in these particular matters, and the FAA officials defended current structure as adequate. They defended the actions they took after Lion Air, after the analysis that we wrote about, saying that the actions they took, they thought at the time were adequate. But clearly lawmakers are concerned enough to be asking questions about what needs to change in the way the law is structured, the oversight system works, and what the FAA should be doing with the manufacturers it regulates.
Andrew, in your reporting, is there anything that's indicated to you that the FAA could be held responsible for this in some sort of legal way? Boeing obviously on the hook, and it seems to be just the beginning of the story for this publicly traded company. But what about the FAA?
That's a question I'm not entirely qualified to answer. Not sure to what extent government officials would be potentially held liable in civil court for actions they took in their official capacity as regulators. But clearly, there are many in Congress who are asking questions, and so there might be change through the legislative method or through the new leadership coming in at the FAA. The U.S. Senate confirmed former Delta Airlines executive Steve Dixon to be the next administrator, so there could be some changes there. A lot is still to unfold. We have 2 accident investigations that are still continuing in Indonesia and Ethiopia, and the results of those investigations have yet to be unveiled. So there could be changes that way, but we still have yet to see how the litigation front will unfold. And there's scores and scores of lawsuits being filed against Boeing. Of course, there are myriad investigations by regulators, by prosecutors, by civil attorneys, and so forth that are ongoing as well.
What about the 737 MAX getting back to the skies? Is it a question still of when, not if, or do you think that conversation has shifted yet? Boeing stock, we should note, still up for the year, more than 5%, underperforming the major indices, but still positive nonetheless, indicating that investors think this is still I don't want to call it a temporary setback because it is much bigger than that, but not fundamentally changing the company's near-term business, or long-term business, excuse me.
Right, investors seem to be comfortable with the signals being telegraphed that the certification is taking a bit longer than expected, or some months longer than expected, of this new fix for the MCAS system. There's another software problem that emerged that Boeing is working on fixing through a software fix and not a hardware fix. So there seems to be just more concern and waiting and so forth about with the time it's taking. But it seems like the industry basically expects for the MAX to be certified again to fly passengers later this year, perhaps in the 4th quarter, as Boeing is estimating, and then airlines soon thereafter could get their fleets back in service and then flying passengers again maybe later this year, maybe early 2020. It seems like there's a fair number of regulators that are likely to, or at least expected to, recertify the MAX to fly again in tandem with the FAA, but it's a very fluid situation, and there's still a lot of unknowns, and that's why on Boeing's earnings call recently, the executives said, hey, look, this is in the hands of regulators, and if it drags on much longer, they might have to consider cutting back production a bit more, or even
Andrew, we are unfortunately going to have to leave it there. That's Andrew Tangel, reporter at the Wall Street Journal. The story is on the front page of today's Journal. I encourage everybody to check it out.